thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. If you'd like to see your name in the credits and gain access to a plethora of other perks, bonuses, and extras, please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
I cannot say what was there before the Big Bang. Physicists sometimes tell us that the word before doesn't even mean anything before the Big Bang. But whatever it was,
but it has to, doesn't it?
You cannot suddenly invoke...
Doesn't it have to? I mean, someone as logical as you are, and I believe you are, you think about this all very logically. A logical mind surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
The arrogance that's on display here is simply breathtaking.
There has to be a power that is greater than the human brain.
Get out of here with that nonsense! Are you kidding me?
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arms.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of the most annoying religious people. Up for today, you're getting 2 for the price of 1, a first in this series. This episode was originally going to be about Piers Morgan all on his own, but as you'll discover in the upcoming footage, it turns out that Piers Morgan has been heavily influenced by apologist one Stephen Meyer. So what follows then is a deconstruction and critique of both Piers Morgan and Stephen Meyer's arguments for the existence of God. And with that said, let's not waste any more time and dive right in. I hope you enjoy it.
Let's talk about this issue of God, because we had a long chat about this last time. I do believe, for what it's worth, I do believe in God. I do believe in an afterlife. I find it comforting. I also find, as I said to you last time,
it's never a great start, is it? When the first words out of a theist's mouth pertain to how comforting they feel their religious beliefs are. Truly, it just blows me away. The number of times I encounter theists who say this without realizing that they might in fact be outing themselves as irrational. Need I state the obvious? The fact that something is comforting is completely irrelevant as to the truth value of the claim. For example, many children are comforted by Santa Claus or Father Christmas mythology. The thought that their good behavior will be rewarded with toys and presents fills them with joy and excitement. In short, the tale is comforting. Yet, the mythology that surrounds Christmas is just that. Mythology. Comforting or not, it's not true, and no serious person would ever suggest otherwise. Returning to Morgan then, why would he ever even dream of bringing up the fact that his religion comforts him? How could such a fact be relevant? To illustrate how bizarre I find this, imagine in his opening comments, Morgan said the opposite. Quote, I do believe, for what it's worth, I do believe in God. I do believe in an afterlife. I find it terrifying. For argument's sake, let's suppose that said terror pertains to fear of hell and eternal damnation. How strange it would have been had he opened in such a manner, right? Well, isn't his actual opening principally the same?
I do believe in God. I do believe in an afterlife. I find it comforting. I also find, as I said to you last time,
perhaps now, if you couldn't already, you have a sense of why I find it so strange that Morgan's first gambit was to relay feelings of contentment associated with his religious beliefs. Clearly, if someone believes something solely because it comforts them, they're engaged in an irrational endeavor. By definition, comfort isn't truth tracking. Sometimes the truth is comforting, and other times it's not. Therefore, comfort is irrelevant. One may wish to defend Morgan here by pointing out that the comfort produced by a belief is relevant in terms of utility. In other words, religious beliefs could be useful in a slew of ways, including, but not limited to, confronting grief, battling nihilism, dealing with one's own mortality, etc. But even if I grant that religion is very useful in all of these ways, again, such utility bears no relevance to the truth claims. So why bring them up? Suffice to say, I believe it's quite telling that the first words out of Morgan's mouth pertained to the comfort his religious beliefs produce in him. Some of you will undoubtedly conclude that I've made too much of a throwaway opening comment, but having listened to Morgan discuss religion numerous times throughout his career, I can assure you that I'm right on the money with this one. In short, comfort is in fact a major pillar upon which Morgan's religious beliefs rest. And by my lights, this is definitionally irrational. And with that said, let's proceed.
I also find, as I said to you last time, I find it explains things which are otherwise completely inexplicable. And we had a guest on recently, Professor Stephen C. Meyer, who's a prominent believer in intelligent design, or what he calls the God hypothesis. He watched our last interview that you and I had, and this is what he said about it.
Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest.
What Morgan and Professor Meyer call an explanation, I would call a just so story. In science and philosophy, a just so story is an untestable narrative explanation for some naturally occurring phenomenon. This phrase is a reference to Rudyard Kipling's 1902 Just So stories, a work containing fictional and deliberately fanciful tales for children, in which the stories pretend to explain animal characteristics such as the origin of leopard spots. The key point here is that it is in fact trivially easy to invent a just so story in order to account for what Meyer would refer to as a phenomenon of interest.
The phenomenon of interest.
For example, if my keys go missing, I could construct a just so story involving key-stealing fairies, thereby explaining what's occurred. Such a story is explanatorily sufficient to account for the phenomenon of interest, namely the missing keys. Why? Because key-stealing fairies have the proclivity and the power to steal my keys. And my keys are in fact missing, therefore key-stealing fairies are a probable explanation. The funny thing is, this just so story would count as a good explanation according to Meyer's own criteria. After all, he alleges that the best explanation is one where you invoke a cause that has the kind of powers to explain the phenomenon of interest.
Where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest.
And as I already pointed out, the key-stealing fairies in my Just So story do in fact possess the relevant powers to steal my keys. Ergo, we've got a candidate best explanation on our hands. Right? Clearly, this approach is bonkers. Just So stories aren't the least bit persuasive or convincing, yet that is precisely what Morgan and Meyer are doing with God. We have this phenomenon that we would like to explain. Only in this case, it's not the missing keys, rather, it's the origin of the universe. So Meyer invents a Just So story involving a being who desires to create our universe and who's powerful enough to create our universe, and boom, we've got ourselves an explanation. Give me a break! Explanation my ass! This is a Just So story by any other name. And what's more, Meyer's Just So story is no more persuasive than my key-stealing fairies story. Suffice to say, having the power to sufficiently account for the phenomenon of interest does not a good explanation make. In my view, a good explanation is testable as opposed to the unfalsifiable garbage we get from theists. A good explanation makes novel predictions. For example, in 1948, Ralph Alpherin predicted that if the Big Bang were true, one should expect to discover cosmic microwave background radiation, a prediction that was later verified, thereby adding credence to the explanation that is Big Bang cosmology. Needless to say, theistic explanations contain no such novel predictions, nor are they testable in any meaningful sense. On the contrary, theists appear to be infinitely flexible when it comes to massaging their theology such that falsification can be prevented. As John Wisdom put it in his awesome and perceptive parable of the gardener, once upon a time, 2 explorers came upon a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing were growing many flowers and many weeds. One explorer says, "Some gardener must tend this plot." The other disagrees. There is no gardener. So they pitch their tents and set a watch. No gardener is ever seen. But perhaps he is an invisible gardener. So they set up a barbed wire fence. They electrify it. They patrol with bloodhounds, for they remember how H.G. Wells, the Invisible Man, could be both smelt and touched, though he could not be seen. But no shrieks ever suggest that some intruder has received a shock. No movements of the wire ever betray an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never give cry. Yet still the believer is not convinced. But there is a gardener, invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks, a gardener who has no scent and makes no sound, a gardener who comes secretly to look after the garden which he loves. At last, the skeptic despairs, but what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even from no gardener at all? By my lights, Wisdom nails it here. Theists will not allow their God to be falsified, choosing instead to amend, update, massage, and edit the theology accordingly. Suffice to say, this is why theistic explanations aren't explanations at all. At best, they're just so-stories, and Morgan and Meyer have done nothing here to convince a rational viewer otherwise. Principally speaking, there's no difference between key-stealing fairies and the god that Morgan and Meyer champion. Both entities have the desire and power to account for the phenomenon of interest, and according to Meyer, that's enough for a hypothesis to be taken seriously as a candidate for the best explanation.
Where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest.
So whether they realize it or not, and despite their protestations to the contrary, Morgan and Meyer's God has more in common with fairies than they realize.
Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies.
And with that said, let's move on.
You correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes the traditional theists have traditionally associated with God.
The idea that materialists have some kind of unique problem vis-a-vis explaining the Big Bang is utter nonsense. Firstly, a la the multiverse hypothesis, it's possible that our universe is but one within a patchwork of universes. Our universe may have been birthed from a parent universe, thereby rendering our universe a daughter universe. This hypothesis wasn't arrived at in a desperate straw-clutching attempt to explain fine-tuning, as theists often assert. No, rather, this hypothesis was birthed by the mathematics on the question. But you don't have to take my word for it. Have a listen.
So, we have top people working on trying to resolve this singularity problem. And in so doing, you get to some ideas that, well, maybe our Big Bang, because the Big Bang is not going to go away. All the data support this. So now I've got this Big Bang thing, okay? And, well, is this embedded in something bigger? Ooh. So when you put like quantum physics and general relativity and you try to come up with some bigger understanding, deeper understanding, string theorists have been all into this, you get a multiverse. We didn't pull that out of our ass. That came out of the equations. So how old is the multiverse? I don't know. It's definitely older than our universe because it birthed our universe and it births other universes and it births, the way the equations drive it, an infinity of universes.
The point is, multiverse theory not only serves as a candidate explanation for the origin of our universe, but it's also compatible with materialism, despite Meyer's claim that materialists are at a loss when it comes to explaining the origins of our universe.
The materialist is really up against a huge conundrum.
And that's just one hypothesis. We could also discuss the possibility that the universe is eternal, thereby removing the need for an external cause altogether. Some viewers will respond negatively to such a hypothesis on the grounds that Big Bang cosmology has proven that the universe is not eternal into the past. But in truth, this is a very common misunderstanding about Big Bang cosmology and what it entails.
You know, we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. So that's a measurement. So because we can measure the speed that all the galaxies are flying away from us, essentially. And then you can run time backwards, if you like, to find out when they were all on top of each other. And so it's quite a simple measurement, and we've done that. So we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. But actually, all we know really was the universe was very hot and very dense at that time. And we have some theories that the universe was in existence before that, and perhaps some sort of circumstantial evidence. And that means that actually the universe could have always been there, eternal.
So the materialist could also appeal to an eternal past. Such a hypothesis further debunks Meyer's assertion that materialists are ill-equipped to deal with questions of origins or the lack thereof. But even if I grant, for the sake of discussion, that the universe necessitates an immaterial cause, it's a non sequitur to jump to a God as the best explanation, let alone the Christian God. Meyer believes he's justified in invoking God because, in his view, whatever caused space, time, and matter to come into existence cannot itself be bound by space, time, and matter. Therefore, the cause of the universe must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. From Meyer's perspective, these attributes are enough for a reasonable person to rationally infer that God is the best explanation.
So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes that traditional theists have traditionally associated with God.
But this is preposterous. Let's just grant that the cause of the universe is in fact spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Does that get us to God? Again, I fail to see the connection. Why would such a cause have to be an agent? That is, a conscious being with a desire to create the universe. Couldn't the spaceless, timeless, and immaterial cause be non-agential? Non-agential causes occur all the time. For example, when the sun melts an ice cube, or when the wind blows some leaves, etc. I see no reason to rule out a non-agential cause for the universe, even if that cause is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Furthermore, all of our inductive experience tells us that consciousness is an emergent property of physical brains, and we only find physical brains inside of physical bodies. Yet, Meyer wants us to believe that the immaterial cause of the universe has a mind. And he believes this despite the embarrassment of evidence which tells us that minds only come attached to physical bodies. So I believe we have a solid inductive argument which sheds doubt on the existence of an immaterial and conscious agent. Theists will be quick to point out that unembodied minds aren't logically impossible, but so what? Unicorns, leprechauns, witches, ghosts, and other gods aren't logically impossible either, but that doesn't mean I should take such entities seriously. The key point is, Meyer and Morgan are kidding themselves if they believe that they've provided anything more than a textbook non sequitur here, and that simply isn't good enough. And the last thing I'd like to draw your attention to before we move on from this portion of the video is that it's absolutely ironic for Meyer to suggest that materialists have some kind of unique problem when it comes to explaining origins.
The materialist is really up against a huge conundrum.
When, in actuality, it's the theist who has a unique problem. Ask yourself, dear listener, How could an immaterial entity cause something physical to happen? How could an immaterial entity have any influence on physical matter at all? If something is truly immaterial, which is to say it's non-physical, it's some kind of an ethereal substance, some kind of soul substance, how could that create a universe? How could it even move an atom? Some viewers may wish to appeal to analogies involving the wind and other invisible forces, and they'll want to point out that those invisible forces can make things move, physical objects in the world move, despite the fact that they are immaterial. But the wind isn't immaterial. Air particles exist, they are just not visible to the human eye. When you're talking about an immaterial entity, when you're talking about the kind of agent that Meyer and Morgan believe in, you're talking about something that's truly non-physical, truly immaterial, which is to say it cannot have any physical properties. How could such an entity possibly create the physical universe? To be clear, I'm not suggesting that my inability to solve the interaction problem serves as evidence for the impossibility of any alleged god or gods interacting with the physical world. Not least because such a claim would be a textbook argument from incredulity fallacy. I'm just drawing your attention to the spectacular irony of Meyer's claim that naturalists have some kind of unique problem when it comes to explaining origins. So spare me your sermon about how materialists have a unique problem when it comes to explaining the universe. Why don't you deal with your own unique problems and let me and other atheists and skeptics worry about the rest? And with that said, let's move on to the next part of the video.
I cannot say what was there before the Big Bang. Physicists sometimes tell us that the word before doesn't even mean anything before the Big Bang. But whatever it was, it
has to, doesn't it?
You cannot suddenly invoke.
Doesn't it have to? I mean, someone as logical as you are, and I believe you are, you think about this all very logically. A logical mind surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
The arrogance that's on display here is simply breathtaking. There has to be something before the Big Bang, alleges Morgan. Otherwise, what is nothing? Please notice that this is a textbook argument from incredulity. Translated, what Morgan is saying here is that there must be something before the Big Bang because he doesn't understand what it would mean for the Big Bang to be preceded by nothing. But one's inability to conceptualize something does not constitute evidence of its falsehood. Worse still is the absolute hypocrisy that's on display here. On one hand, Morgan wants to hold physicists' feet to the fire on their suggestion that the concept of before the Big Bang is nonsensical.
Well, it makes no sense, does it? And that's what I mean. I think you're a logical man. That cannot make sense to you. The idea that you're not even allowed to use the word before the Big Bang, when every part of both of our brains tells us that that's obviously nonsensical. Doesn't that make you think again?
Meanwhile, Morgan believes in an eternal God. Were we to ask Morgan what happened before God, he would be very quick to say something very similar, which is, there is no before God. Oh, I see. So physicists are completely out of bounds when they suggest that there's no before the Big Bang. But when theists say there's no before God, that's A-OK. That's called having it all your own way. But even if I grant Morgan that the concept of there being no before the Big Bang is incredibly counterintuitive, the following question remains. Why should we expect the universe to make sense to us? Why should we expect it to conform to our intuitions? As Dawkins himself explains to Morgan,
modern physics is exceedingly mysterious. It really is. I mean, have you tried to read some of the difficult modern physics books? It really is very difficult to understand. And intuition doesn't do it. You cannot use human intuition. Human intuition was built up by evolution over many millions of years to survive on the African plain, hunting and gathering, looking for waterholes, looking for mates and so on. Our brains were not built to understand the profundities of the origin of the universe, the end of the universe, the kind of things that physicists deal with.
And it's at this moment that Morgan wins the most idiotic theist of the year award?
It's because the human brain can't comprehend this, including, I don't think, any physicist. Because the moment they say you can't have before the Big Bang, they lose me completely just on a common sense perspective. It's that reason that I think there has to be a power that is greater than the human brain. And that gives me succor to my belief in God, and why I think people turn to gods of different types, obviously. They turn to that because it is incomprehensible otherwise what has happened here.
He doubles down and says that it's precisely because Big Bang cosmology violates common sense that there has to be, quote, a power that is greater than the human brain.
There has to be a power that is greater than the human brain.
Oh, brother. Translated, what Morgan is saying here is that science doesn't make sense to me, therefore God. This is an argument from incredulity on steroids. It's bafflingly stupid and profoundly arrogant to boot. And the most frustrating thing for me is that all of this garbage is stated with the implied message that the theistic answer to such questions is intuitive and parsimonious, when in fact the reality couldn't be more different. Are you telling me, Mr. Piers Morgan, that an all-loving, all-powerful, unembodied, immaterial mind which exists outside of space and time is intuitive? Are you telling me that virgin birds, walking on water, resurrections, and miraculous healings are intuitive? Do these things satisfy your definition of common sense?
They lose me completely just on a common sense perspective.
Get out of here with that nonsense! Are you kidding me? Clearly, none of this constitutes common sense, nor is any of it intuitive. But you know what? Who cares? Common sense and intuition couldn't be more irrelevant. I don't rule out religious claims using my intuitions. Common sense doesn't play a role in my epistemology. I prioritize testability, predictive power, and evidence. I just wish Morgan would do the same, as opposed to arrogantly assuming that his petty, small-minded intuitions are the guarantor of what's true or false. Give me a bloody break. The only thing that's uncensored about your show, Mr. Morgan, is the unabashed manner in which you share your stupidity with the world.